Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Sydney Yeager. I'm the public programs producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Thank you so much for joining us in person this evening. We are so excited to have you here for this lecture this evening with Zachary Mazer, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. We hope that if you didn't have a chance today, that you will join us, that you will come back and see our exhibitions, including the new exhibition that's behind me, Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which tells the story of the Danish rescue and is our first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. We are so, like I said, we're so happy to have you here. We hope that you will also join us for our upcoming programs, including the New York Jewish Book Festival, which begins on November 12th and runs through November 19th. You can find more information on our website. You should have received a note card as you walked in. If you didn't, I have more over here. But we do ask that you write your questions down on those cards, and we'll collect them towards the end of the lecture. So just keep a lookout for me, and I will collect those. So thank you so much for joining us today. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Zachary Mazer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. It's a trying time, but it's nice to be together. So hopefully a little bit of community does us some good. Today I'm going to be talking about disinformation, as it says in the title. But before I talk about that, I just want to differentiate between disinformation and misinformation. So disinformation is very different from misinformation. Misinformation is just something that's wrong, right? So what's the difference? Disinformation is something that is wrong on purpose. It is there in order to trick us in some way. And we are all very hungry for information. As you've all noticed, you're constantly looking at your phones, you're looking at the news, and we are really hardwired to look for information because we as human beings, we need to kind of assess danger around us, so we need to figure out what's going on, and then we can figure out if we're safe right now or we're not. So what disinformation does is it turns that natural instinct that we have to look for information, and it turns it against us. And a lot of times that disinformation can be innocuous, but sometimes it's not. And there's also a cognitive bias that makes us susceptible to disinformation, and that is described here, sometimes called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Some of you might have heard about. This really speaks to me because this is basically the pathway in graduate school. So at the beginning, before you enter graduate school, you are at the peak of Mount Stupid. You think that you know something, and then you enter graduate school and you dive right down into that valley of despair. You understand that you know nothing. But the point here is less about making fun of myself, more about the fact that when, and we see this online all the time, when people do not know anything about a subject, they are very, very confident in their own opinions. They know exactly what's going on in the world. They are military experts, spy experts, water experts, whatever the case may be, or contagious disease experts, as we experienced over the past couple of years. So we all see this. So how does this relate to the Holocaust? There is one particular scholar or sociologist who was writing about disinformation and what people knew during the Holocaust, and she says specifically that resistance occurred when and where Jews were able to gain information about the Nazi regime's genocidal plans and believed that information to be credible. So in her estimation, she's theorizing that if people knew more about what was happening to them, then they would be more susceptible to rise up against what was happening. And you may disagree with this. Maybe it's kind of judgment made, an armchair judgment on people's decisions, but it's an interesting thesis. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about this. All right, so why didn't the Jews know what was happening to them? I think we have to return our minds to to a place where people do not know that the Holocaust is happening. So we have to erase that from our minds. If we want to understand what Jews knew at the time, we kind of have to get rid of this teleology, the thought that we already know what's going to happen next, right? All right, but before that, obviously, the Nazi regime was really based on disinformation. So from the very beginning, that disinformation was targeted towards Germans for obvious reasons. And later on, disinformation was spread all around. So one of the very first moments of disinformation within the Nazi regime was the 1933 Reichstag fire, an event that probably many of you know about, but it was the excuse given to the Nazis to take over and essentially institute an authoritarian government within Germany. And it was a kind of staged event where the Reichstag was lit on fire, and socialists and communists were blamed for that event, for that attack on the government, right? The Reichstag was the parliament. And then in 1938, November 9th, 1938, the kind of countrywide pogrom happened called Kristallnacht, and this was caused by an assassination that took place actually in Paris. So a disgruntled person who had been wronged in lots of ways, Henryk Greenspan, he was a Polish Jew from Germany, had been living in Germany, his family had been kicked out, mistreated in lots of ways, and he took his anger out on the ambassador to Germany in Paris. And as a result, Germans blamed all of the Jews for this event, and then set off this countrywide pogrom in November 1938. And finally, in September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, it wasn't as if they said, oh, let's go out, on an imperialist quest to invade Poland. They instead said that there was an attack on their radio station in Gliwice, today Gliwice in Poland, and they also claimed that there was a mass killing of Germans taking place in Bydgoszcz, in a Polish city. And so that was sort of the setup for invading Poland in 1939. So when the Nazis invaded, they obviously took over all of these sources of information, and I'm going to go through each of these in turn to try to give you a sense of what people knew, what their sources of information were, and what that looked like. So newspapers were obviously hugely important. Before the war, there were, 790,000 Jewish newspapers were in circulation in Poland before the war. So a huge number, right? And most of those were in Yiddish. There were about 180,000 in Polish, 10,000 in Hebrew. So Hebrew was not being used yet as a language of everyday use, but there were some people who were interested in producing daily newspapers in Hebrew. But when the Germans invaded, they banned all printing in Hebrew and Yiddish. And so people who couldn't read the Latin alphabet, people who couldn't read in Polish or German, they were essentially cut off from information. And at the same time, they established a official Jewish newspaper, and you can see the masthead of this newspaper, Gazeta Żydowska, meaning Jewish newspaper, quite literally. And this was only produced weekly. So it wasn't even a daily newspaper. And most of the news, if you can read Polish, you can tell, but most of the news is focused on the war. So this was a very, very important topic for everybody at the time. People were really focused on the minutia of the war. They were trying to see, based on the outcome of certain battles, to see, is the war moving in one direction or the other? And the man up on the right, Ludwig Landau, he was a statistician, quite famous statistician, Polish-Jewish man, and he was assimilated, so he spoke Polish very well, and he was able to hide outside of the ghetto. And what was he using his time to do? He was writing a chronicle of the war. And he was reading every newspaper that he could get his hands on and listening to the radio and trying to construct a chronicle of what was going on. And his main focus were, again, these battles. He was really, really focused on what was happening in the war. Radio was obviously very, very important as well during this time. However, radios were banned. So Poles and Jews were not allowed to own radios. They were confiscated, and there was actually a list of people who owned radios because people had to pay kind of a subscription fee to own a radio. So it was quite easy to figure out who owned a radio. But despite that, there were people who kept a radio, managed to hide it, or some people actually constructed little homemade radios. I don't know if anybody had a kit like that as a little kid. You could, take some transistors and a battery and kind of construct a radio. And so that was something that was happening as well. So they were listening to radio stations from London. The BBC was broadcasting. They were broadcasting in Polish and German. And they were also listening to some underground radio stations that were operating in a few places. But at the same time, the Germans were using this against them. So they were also broadcasting their own propaganda. And so people had to kind of figure out what was true and what was false. Letters were also a very powerful tool for sharing information, perhaps the most powerful tool when you think about it, because if you're receiving a letter from someone you assume that that's trustworthy information, right? You're getting a letter from your sister, your uncle, or whatever, and you assume that they're telling you the truth. But that wasn't always the case. So there were cases when prisoners at Auschwitz were actually forced to write letters home to their family to let them know that everything is fine. We're being treated well, we have food, we have medicine, whatever. And this was obviously a strategy intended to trick people into thinking that if they were being deported to a camp, that it did not mean certain death, and that they weren't facing some kind of imminent danger. And all letters were censored, as you can imagine. So if you were living within a ghetto, your mail would be censored first by the Jewish Council and also by the Sicherheitsdienst, that's the intelligence agency of the SS. Letters could not be written in Yiddish or Hebrew script, so people, again, who were only literate in that way were essentially cut off from information. And up until 1941, there was still strong communication between the United States and occupied territories, because the United States was neutral up until that point. And so there are cases when people were in the ghettos of Eastern Europe and receiving packages, receiving letters from New York, right, from their relatives in New York. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. But as soon as the United States entered the war in December 1941, they were cut off from that source of information. And the only way to get a message across the enemy lines, as they were, was to go through the Red Cross. And the Red Cross would allow you to send a message, but it was only 25 words long. There are also a number of posters that were produced specifically for propaganda purposes. On the right side, you have a kind of poster pillar. This is a weird thing that doesn't exist in the US, but it's a German invention, a kind of big cement pillar, and people would put up posters all around it. And these were put up everywhere to inform people, also inform the illiterate. And there were also a number of films produced. The poster on the left is a poster for a movie called Jews, Lice, and Typhus. And this was a quite popular movie, unfortunately, but it was a propaganda film all about how the Jews were carriers of disease and not to be trusted. So the idea was not only to make people think about Jews as being somehow dirty, but also to keep people physically away from Jews. Don't talk to Jews because they're going to give you typhus. So fighting against all of this propaganda coming from the German side were also underground newspapers. And here we have a couple of examples of underground newspapers. The first thing that you might notice about them is that they're in Yiddish. And so this opens up an opportunity for people to read it, people who wouldn't otherwise have access to that kind of thing. But they were also all associated with political parties. So the most prolific of the underground newspapers was a communist newspaper called Morgenfreiheit, Freedom Tomorrow. And that was obviously propaganda of its own kind, right? So it wasn't completely telling everyone the truth. Unfortunately, the underground press didn't reach a very wide audience. There were only about 45 to 81,000 readers within the Warsaw Ghetto. So that's about 10 to 20% of the Warsaw Ghetto. We can assume that in other ghettos, that number would be even lower because the access to printing presses was much better in these places, in Warsaw than in other places. All right. So you may be wondering about where we have all this information about, sort of what was the media environment, and one of the greatest sources for that is the One Shabbat Archive. How many here have heard of the One Shabbat Archive? Oh, a fair amount. That's great. So One Shabbat, of course, is the sort of get together that happens after services, Friday services. And this was the name of the club that got together, an underground group that was put together by Emanuel Ringelblum, the man on the top left there. And he was a historian, and he decided when the war started that he really wanted to document what was happening to the Jews. So he started this program of collecting all kinds of information, including documenting what was being said on the radio. So that's one of the reasons why we even know what was happening on the radio. And it's a really amazing resource. We've now recovered about 35,000 pages of documents. They were buried underground before really the end of the ghetto, when most of the ghetto's residents were deported to Treblinka and killed. So they managed to survive in metal boxes and in milk canisters. That's what's up on the top right there. There were 3 caches of documents. 2 have been recovered. 1 is still missing, and it's presumed to be underneath the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. So if anybody has any good connections with the Chinese government, we can maybe get that back. But for now, they're just saying no. They won't even let anybody look. But one thing that's really unique about this archival project was they weren't just collecting documents, they weren't just collecting newspapers, they were also creating new information. And so as part of this project, people like Rachel Auerbach, they actually started collecting testimony. And so they would interview people who would tell them about their experiences. And in this way, Rachel Auerbach is really the founder of Holocaust testimony. Like she was collecting Holocaust testimony before the Holocaust was even over, right? And she interviewed lots of escapees, but she did a number of amazing things. Google her, really amazing woman. Anyway, so as part of this project of interviewing various people, we have some of the first reports of the Holocaust as it was happening that were contained within this archive. So Ari Vilner here, he managed to escape from an area around Vilna, modern-day Lithuania, where really the Holocaust was beginning. So the Holocaust didn't begin, as we all know, with camps, but it began really with people being shot over pits. So this is the so-called Holocaust by bullets. And so at this moment, Ari Vilner happened to be in this place, in the Ponari forest. He witnessed 45,000 Jews being rounded up and killed, managed to come to Warsaw, and gave his testimony to the One Shabbat group. Then Szlamek Wiener, he managed to escape from the very first death camp at Helmno, and he also gave his testimony. He was basically the first reporter of the mass killing in camps, and there was a report that was distributed called the Grojnowski Report because of his nom de guerre, Jakub Grojnowski, and and so this report went all around, supposedly even got to American and British intelligence, but nobody did anything with it. And he was sought after by the Gestapo because of what he knew, and ultimately he was caught, and so he did not survive the Holocaust. Jankel Wernick, he managed to escape from Treblinka, a place almost no one managed to escape from. And he got out because of an uprising, actually, that took place in 1943 when a bunch of inmates threw grenades and started attacking the Germans, and a few of them managed to survive. He was one of those very, very few. And he gave his testimony as well to the One Shabbat Archive. And at that time, he said, "For your sake alone, I continue to hang on to my miserable life, though it has lost all attraction for me. Time and again, I wake up in the middle of the night, moaning pitifully. Ghastly nightmares break up the sleep I so badly need. I see thousands of skeletons extending their bony arms towards me as if begging for mercy and help. But I, drenched in sweat, feel incapable of doing anything." And despite the suicidal tone of what he was saying here, he did not take his own life, but he managed to survive and moved to Israel and lived a long life. So we may ask, because of all this information that was available, why did people believe the official narratives? Well, first of all, the official narratives that people were being told when they were, being brought to a deportation center or to a train was that they were going to work in the East, right? And at that point, they were also being convinced in lots of ways by the environment around them that they were going to be safe. And really, the Germans cultivated an environment where people would believe it. So it seemed like normalcy kind of lulled people into believing these things. We have to kind of bring our minds back to this space where people are making insurance payments, they're getting pensions from the government, they are, worried about their kids' schooling or whatever, right? And these kinds of things are top of mind rather than thinking that it's possible that they would just be sent to a place to be killed. And there were also a number of organizations built for the purpose of tricking people. So, for example, there was a Jewish social services organization that was run by the SS. They were literally getting donations from the West. They were getting medicine and food delivered through Portugal and then Switzerland and then on to occupied Poland, and then delivered to this, Jewish social services organization, supposedly to help out Jews who were in camps. But that was, of course, not the purpose of it. Maybe a little bit of aid got there. The head of this organization, Michal Weichert, interestingly enough, he had a trial after the war for collaborating with the Nazis, but he was acquitted because they figured out that some of the aid may have gotten to some people and, therefore it didn't count. But the point is that these kinds of institutions would convince other people that they were safe. So toward the end of the war, 1944, Hungary tried to sue for peace. They tried to get out of the war by themselves. The Nazis, of course, did not like that. They took over Hungary. And then at that point, most of the Hungarian Jews who had been safe up to that point were then deported to Auschwitz and killed. And hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed in that way. And just as an aside from that moment, so there was a survivor who's writing about this point when the Hungarian Jews are being deported, and he was at a train station at a point where he would have been interacting with them, and he wrote, "These people absolutely did not know for what purpose they were being deported. They had no idea what was in store for them. They were sanctimoniously convinced that they were going for work. How far these Jews were ignorant of the situation is evidenced by the fact that some of them, prior to their deportation, wrote letters to their acquaintances in Poland asking them to reserve apartments, to rent apartments at the Majdanek treatment site where they would be resettled for the duration of the war. And when some at the stations tried to warn them of what awaited them there, they were usually indignant, considering it a bad joke." So, as you can see, I strongly think that looking at this lens of disinformation is quite useful for understanding the Holocaust, for understanding why resistance didn't happen at the scale that we might have expected. And I also think that there are some lessons for our own disinformation age. And I do want to hear your questions. I definitely want to get into some more discussion about this, but my kind of pithy summary would be that the truth is difficult. The truth is hard. And if we want to get at something true, then we have to work at it. But if we accept the easy answers, then we won't be getting at any truth. So thank you. Sure. Should I repeat the question?
Yes.
Okay. So the question was, were these tactics of disinformation new, or were they developed earlier or developed during the First World War? Is that what you said? Sydney?
Yes.
Developed during the First World War. So some things did not exist in the First World War, like radio was not a thing yet, for example. And also, the medium of film was not really in existence yet. So those things didn't exist during the First World War. At the same time, I think the basic tactics of feeding disinformation definitely existed, right? There wasn't much of an invention in using disinformation as part of the war effort, right? As part of a strategy of war.
Thank you. And then, so you showed that quote near the end that people who were being deported had no idea of where they were going, and they thought they were going for work, but when they saw a cattle car, like, can you talk a little bit more about how there was sort of that cognitive dissonance between what they were saying?
Okay, so the question is about seeing a cattle car and not thinking about what it would mean. I think that our kind of symbolic universe says that a cattle car means one thing, and for them it didn't mean anything yet. It was just a train car, and they were being put on it. Right. What's on the other end of that train car is not something that they could know. Right. It was not something that was knowable yet. And of course, it was uncomfortable, but there's no reason to automatically think that it means that you're being led to your death. There's still so much of our. Sure, they would be mistreated and be forced to work, and they may face death, but not being murdered on a mass scale. Yeah. So go ahead.
So you talked about how they were publishing Jewish newspapers even after the war, even if they were in Polish and German, the dominant languages. How did they continue to publish if it was known to be a Jewish newspaper?
So the question is about how they would publish a Jewish newspaper. So the Jewish newspaper that I showed you, Gazeta Żydowska, was an official German sanctioned newspaper. So it was a Nazi sanctioned newspaper. So that's why. But it was obviously it was heavily censored, and it was only published once a week.
Can you talk about how Reitner learned about what was happening, the telegram that you showed? How do you know the telegram that you showed, the Reitner from Reitner, I believe? No? Never mind.
I didn't show a telegram. I'm not sure.
Matt, do you want to just say your
In the framework of disinformation and people finally learning about what was happening in Europe, I thought you might be able to comment on the Reader telegram. Was the diplomat that tried to get to Steve
Yes.
I'm sorry for all.
No. I just didn't show. I didn't show that. Okay, sorry. That was my confusion. No, I mean, so there were, like I mentioned, one of the less known report about the Holocaust is this one, right? Probably one that you haven't heard of. Right. Yeah. So there were a few attempts. So the Regner telegram is one. There was also the Karski report. So there was a person from the Polish underground who had been at Auschwitz. So he had a meeting with Frankfurter in Washington. He had a meeting with FDR in Washington. Told FDR what was happening, and FDR decided that it wasn't worth it. Right. So the excuse that they kept on going over was, oh, it's risky. We could go and fly over and bomb the train tracks, but it's not worth it. They'll just rebuild the train tracks tomorrow. So anyway, that's a whole other thing. Yeah.
How widely disseminated were the underground press materials?
Right. So I said that in the Warsaw Ghetto, the underground press materials were getting to about 10 to 20% of the population, so not very many. And the underground press is really interesting because they were actually analyzing very closely the official press and kind of deconstructing it. So they would, take an article and tell you, here are the lies, right? And this is why they're lying about it. So it was very helpful if you could get it, but they couldn't produce it on a mass scale.
Did anybody outside of the Warsaw Ghetto encounter the underground press, or was it?
Yeah, so the underground press did get to other places, but even fewer and fewer people were able to get access to that in other ghettos. So the Warsaw Ghetto was probably the best, just because they had the printing capacity, they had paper, they had ink, and that wasn't possible in other ghettos.
And sorry. Going through the questions I already asked. Can you tell us about where you currently work?
Sure. So the question was, where do I currently work? So I work at the Polin Museum in Warsaw. You guys have a little bit of information about that museum. It is not a Holocaust museum per se. It's a museum of Eastern European Jewry from its beginning to now. So it's a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, and I highly recommend that you come to Warsaw, see it.
I also. So, thank you. From Hitler's speeches, I guess to us now they can seem fairly straightforward. So, was there any sort of denial of, did denial play any role in this sort of disinformation?
So does denial play a role in disinformation? I think in general we are all susceptible to believe what we want to believe, and so even if you you heard from Hitler's speeches that he wanted to eliminate the Jews, then maybe you would understand that as deportation, right? And there was talk of deportation. There was a talk of moving the Jews to Madagascar or moving them to the east. And then when people were hearing that they were going to work in the east, they thought, okay, yeah, that was the plan, right? They were supposed to be deporting the Jews to the east, so that's where we're going, to some kind of reservation. So that was another thing that's quite interesting about this, is they were comparing it to the Native Americans in the United States. And say, well, they're going to build a reservation for the Jews and just put them over there, right? So that was the more thinkable kind of explanation for what was happening.
And I think this is a bit of a follow-up question to that. There had been a history of pogroms throughout Europe. So why was there such kind of incredulity that something like this could happen?
Yeah, so the question is about, did pogroms make them more susceptible to believe that the Holocaust could happen? I think that pogroms, obviously, they're horrible events, but they result in a few dozen deaths at most, and injuries and property destroyed. A pogrom was never intended to eliminate the entire Jewish community, and that's something, again, that was unthinkable. You could imagine some people getting hurt, but it was unthinkable to imagine that every single man, woman, and child would be killed. So.
How comprehensive was the censorship of mail?
How comprehensive was censorship of mail? So it was quite comprehensive, and that would mean that certain sections could be literally cut out, like with an X-Acto knife. And it also could mean that some letters just wouldn't be delivered. So it was quite rare that, that things like even complaints about conditions would get through. But people were also figuring out like how to say certain things without saying it, right? So, yeah, everybody knew that the mail was censored. So, but people were figuring out, what things would get through, what things wouldn't, and some of it was random, obviously. Like you're being judged by a human being who can make certain decisions, but it wasn't just one layer of censorship. It was at least two, including somebody from the SS reading it.
So were there like set standards for how to censor mail, or was it really up to the?
There were standards for how to censor mail, which would be an interesting topic. I've never looked at that, but as the Germans are wont to do, they did create like a set of rules for how to censor mail and what things could and couldn't be said.
So the first reports that you mentioned of people coming in during the war, did they kind of grasp how large the Holocaust was at the time, or did they think it was more localized?
I think especially with this report, the question is, did people grasp the size of the Holocaust with these testimonies? I think with this report in particular, for the people who read it, it was clear that that this was a mass murder that was going on, and that it could only sort of continue. So that was pretty clear to the people who read it and believed it, right? So those are two very important conditions. Just knowing that this report exists is not enough. You also have to think next step and say this is where this is going, right?
I just want to make sure there's anybody else with any other questions before I. Let me grab you. Okay, so I'm going to combine. We have a few that I'm going to combine into one
Yeah.
question. What are the warning signs for disinformation that we can take from this knowledge today in our kind of really information-heavy world? Like, what are the first signs, in your opinion, that things are changing, and what should we be looking out for?
So the question is, what are the signs of disinformation that we can look out for? I think so. Disinformation can come in lots of different forms, obviously, as I talked about. But sort of the easiest way to recognize disinformation is if somebody is giving you an answer that seems to answer. Giving you an answer that answers lots of questions all at once. So if you're given a piece of information that suddenly explains the whole world in one shot, it's a good chance that that's not true, right? If everything starts to circle together, then that's false information. That's probably disinformation. Like I said at the end. The truth is hard. To understand what is actually going on in the world at any time is always difficult. So if you're being given an easy answer in the current conflict, if you're given an easy explanation for why something is happening on the ground, that's probably wrong. It's always much more complicated.
And did people in the U.S. and UK press, were they getting their information from these kind of official press sources, or how were they getting information?
So the question is, were people in the West, in the UK and the US, also getting their information from these sources? really interesting question. So the UK and the US press was also controlled in its own way. So they were getting information from their own sort of military sources and revealing things piecemeal sometimes. Really interestingly, there were reports of the Holocaust that people knew about that could have been reported in the US and the UK press. The first newspaper to put it on the front page and to really, talk about it at length was the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a black newspaper in Pittsburgh. And I think it's really, really fascinating because for the black community in the United States, this was something that was thinkable. And for kind of polite society in, New York or Boston or wherever else in DC, it was unthinkable. So even if they did get these reports, they'd say, those Jews, they're exaggerating something, but it wasn't imaginable for so much of polite society that was running, the New York Times or other newspapers. So,
Were
yeah.
Jewish presses in the U.S. or UK running different stories, or no?
Yeah, so the follow-up was if Jewish newspapers were writing about this. Surprisingly, no. Jewish newspapers were not writing about this. And there might have been some self-censorship in that as well. But like I said, the first newspaper to really run with it on the front page was the Pittsburgh Courier. So.
And so you kind of talked about how people, like I said before, they didn't know where they were going. But were many of were at the point, I guess, when people were starting to be sent to concentration camps, had they been in ghettos and things like that at that point?
Yeah, so the question was if people were in ghettos before they were being sent to other camps. Yes, so that was the kind of order of things, is that people would be concentrated into a ghetto, sometimes into a transfer ghetto, and then ultimately to a camp.
So then, if people were being mistreated in many of these ghettos and were being starved and things like that, how did how did sort of disinformation play into convincing them that they were going to work if they were in such bad shape?
Yeah, so how did disinformation play into convincing them that they were relatively safe if they were being mistreated in the ghetto? So I do think that we still need to kind of differentiate between people, not getting enough to eat or not having access to medicine and people literally being murdered en masse. So those are two different things. So even if people understood that like a lot of their relatives were dying of typhus or of starvation, if they're getting on the train, they think that they're going to some place else. The conditions are going to be different. And in a lot of cases, they were enticed to go to a collection point to get on the train because they were offered bread and jam. And you're telling starving people to go show up for bread and jam, and a lot of people show up. So.
So we're kind of getting to the end of our time, so I'm just going to ask you a couple. I'm sorry if we can't get to everybody's questions, but I do want to ask just a couple more that are on here and things like that. But if you were to give people more information, like where can people get more information about this topic? What resources would you recommend?
So more information about this topic. I can't think of anything more on this particular topic, like an easy place to get more information. The Ringelblum archive, the One Shabbat Archive that I mentioned, that is all online. So there's been a huge project going on with the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw to transcribe every single page of it. And they've been transcribing it and then translating it into Polish. It's in various languages, in Yiddish and German and Polish. But that's completed now. They have transcribed every single page of it into Polish, and it's being translated into English also. So a bunch of volumes are available in English. You can look it up online and read, any bit of the archive that you want in English. But as far as other resources, I mean, I think that that, and then also the Center for Holocaust Research has a great website on the Warsaw Ghetto.
And for
How can we combat disinformation? I mean, number one rule of disinformation is don't spread it. Even if you want to share it and tell your friends, isn't this so stupid? Just don't share it. And the other thing about disinformation is that it's not always easy. So fact checking doesn't work. This is a scary thing, but it's true. You cannot convince someone who believes something that they're wrong based on fact checking. Because we're in the realm of emotions at a certain point, right? We're not having a debate about facts. We're having a debate about what somebody feels about something. So if you're talking about someone who's close to you and your family who is believing disinformation, then maybe it's easier to approach them and have a conversation at the level of emotions to try to get them someplace else. But other than that, I don't think there's a lot of hope for convincing strangers, especially on the internet. Don't waste your time trying to convince strangers on the internet that they're wrong. So, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everyone.